when we define the digital water universe or the digital water market, metering is the single largest piece of that pie.
I'm Reese Tisdale, and this is Future Water, in which we talk about all the ways which companies, utilities, and people are addressing the challenges and opportunities in water. This is episode 67, and I'm pretty sure it's going to be a good one. Why is that? Because I'm joined today by Bluefield Research's Eric Bindler to talk about the state and outlook, meaning forecast, for the global water metering market. It's a key piece of the water infrastructure puzzle, sometimes often referred to as the cash register. Bluefield is just about to release a new report on the company market share forecasts and company strategies. And I'm not going to lie, I've seen the report, and it's going to be a good one, just like this conversation with Eric. But before we jump into things, I want to sound off an alarm bell. Globally, 785 million people do not have access to clean water. As such, women and girls are more often burdened by the task of walking to and carrying water back home to provide for their families and communities. The average round trip to a water source, 2.4 miles or 5 hours per day, carrying about 5 gallons. I've seen it. I've lived it. I promise you it happens. I know it's far from many of our worlds, but it is the truth. For this reason, among others, Bluefield Research is partnering with WaterAid in the ramp up to World Water Day on 22nd of March, 2023. Since 1981, WaterAid has worked in 34 countries in which it has reached 28.5 million people, providing clean water and sanitation. All right, so I'm joined here today by Eric Bindler. Eric.
How's it going, Reese?
Pretty good. Just, I don't know, I'm sort of in a lot of different worlds going on. Like I'm single parenting this week. I've got spring break coming up for the next 2 weeks and just trying to keep it together in addition to just doing some work. What about you?
Yeah, I'm in, almost new parent mode. So just kind of working during the week and then putting together baby furniture and bolting things to walls and getting all that stuff set up. So it's been a lot of fun.
Nice. I don't know if we've actually mentioned it on this podcast, but yeah, for everybody now in the know, Eric's about to have a child. So be on the lookout.
Yeah.
So Eric, as a run up to that, I know there's been a bit of a crunch and doing some analysis on the water metering market, meaning, some have called it the cash register for the utility in some respects. So let's talk a little bit about water meters. I mean, what are we talking about and how do we define that segment?
Yeah. So, at a very, basic level that I think our listeners will be pretty familiar with, right? Water meters are just the devices that monitor water consumption at people's homes and businesses, in some cases, individual apartments, and that kind of thing. And like you said, they kind of have traditionally been used primarily for billing, right? They have been kind of treated as the cash register of the utility. But I think as we see more movement around this kind of digital transformation in the industry, meters are a big part of that. And utilities are increasingly realizing this kind of broader range of things that they can do with their meter data. They can be used for a lot more than just billing. And I think we can get into that in a minute. In terms of how we define the space, when we talk about, in terms of how we've titled the report, we're not specifically calling it a water meter report. We're talking about metering as this kind of broader set of technologies and services. And so, kind of consistent with how we approach the digital water market as a whole, we're certainly talking about the technology. We're talking about the hardware, meters themselves, but also the radio units or the endpoints that typically communicate the data from meters back to the utility. So that could be AMR or walk-by, drive-by endpoints. It could also be AMI or fully remote endpoints. So we do break those out in the report. But beyond just the hardware and the kind of the equipment piece of it, we're also talking about, software, right? There's all kinds of different software vendors and applications out there that can manage that data or analyze that data or integrate it with other types of water data. We're also talking about the different types of communications, right? There's many different and kind of a growing landscape of communications protocols and networks that can be used to actually get that data off of the meters or the endpoints and transmit it back to the utilities, platforms or their back office or their billing systems. So there's a lot of activity happening there. And then we're also talking about services, right? There's this kind of whole ecosystem of professional service providers around metering, from, just kind of planning and planning projects or designing communications networks to actually installing the devices in everybody's house in the community to the kind of after sales, ongoing support and maintenance to actually keep that meter fleet and keep all of that communications equipment up and running.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting, and I think this is really what you're touching upon, is that the meters have gone over time or evolved from just this one piece of hardware that was for billing. Now they've really become, partly through technology advancements, have become tools for understanding or providing a better understanding of not only what's happening within a household or a commercial facility, but also within the network itself. And so there's this myriad of solutions sort of trying to patch onto it, whether it be hardware or software. So I guess, one question is going to be, you've talked a lot about it. There's a big story here, but why the focus on meters? Why should we care?
Yeah. So, you kind of touched on a few things there, but just to back up a little bit, I mean, in terms of when we think about digital water and we define digital water, and some of our listeners may know we put out a big kind of global digital water market forecast last year. Metering is the biggest piece of that, right? We cover a range of different technologies in that report, but when we define kind of the digital water universe or the digital water market, metering is the single largest piece of that pie. It accounts for about a third of total spending on digital water technology and services globally, in at least the utility sector, the water utility sector. So that's kind of one big reason why we're focusing on it, because it's the biggest piece of the pie. I think also when we're thinking about it from the perspective of utilities, smart metering in particular, kind of investing in metering, but smart or digital metering like remote metering, AMI, it often is one of the earliest stages in a utilities or even a kind of a broader city's digital journey, right? It's kind of one of the core, when we think about the core building blocks that a utility needs to have in place to kind of move towards greater stages of digital maturity or more advanced, data integration or data-driven decision making. Just having that more, close to real-time, regular, remote transmitted meter data is a really valuable tool, alongside things like, SCADA platforms or GIS or hydraulic modeling. And actually the communications networks themselves, the kind of communications investments that utilities make to be able to get remote, data from all of their, thousands or even millions of metering devices throughout their service areas. Those network investments can also be really useful for other types of applications. And that's where we start to see this kind of smart city discussion, where maybe a city-owned water utility invests in an AMI network, and then that same network can also be used for, electric or gas metering. It can be used for other types of IoT applications like, smart streetlights or smart parking or whatever the case may be. So, it is a kind of a foundational element or a foundational investment in this kind of broader digital transformation of the utility sector, of kind of municipal government more broadly. And then the third thing, which kind of gets back to your point and to the point that I started with, utilities, I think, are increasingly seeing the potential value and the potential power of their metering platforms if they learn how to use them a little bit more extensively, right? If they learn how to kind of harness that data, they are the cash register, right? They are the primary touch point with customers. And so, if utilities want to get into this mode of more proactive customer management, proactive customer engagement, they really the meter is the point at which they're interfacing with their customers. If they want to be able to detect potential high bills and alert their customers proactively that maybe there's going to be a high bill coming, they need access to real-time data. If the customer calls in and has an issue, they typically need to have access to that data. If they want to, bill accurately and recover revenue, they need to have that, the meter is where that happens, right? And being able to actually recover, especially for kind of larger commercial and industrial facilities, having an accurate account of the amount of water being used to be able to actually bill for that and recover that revenue. It's really critical to their, utilities kind of overall financial profile. So there's the customer piece of it and the kind of billing and revenue recovery piece of it. But as you mentioned, right, there's all of these other things that you can do with this data. Metering data is really critical in terms of leak detection, right? And especially as we're seeing more climate related pressures, more water scarcity, water stress in a lot of different parts of the world. Metering is one of the, kind of critical tools that utilities have in their tool belts to deal with water loss, right? Both to help understand where their customers may be losing water, where customers may have leaks on the, the kind of customer side of the meter, but also even within their own networks, right? If you kind of measure essentially, right, you measure how much water you're putting into the system, and then you measure how much water is being consumed by your customers, you have a pretty decent estimate of how much has been lost along the way, right? And from there, you can start to figure out maybe where it is, especially if you're doing district metering and things like that. So there's the kind of climate and water stress pressure. And then it's also, meter data, that kind of flow or consumption data, especially when kind of put in tandem with other types of water network data, water quality data or water pressure data. It gives operators a pretty good understanding of what's going on within their distribution networks, right? And, this is something that we talk about a lot in this industry, on this podcast. One of the biggest challenges of the water industry is that, the vast majority of the assets that utilities are managing are underground. They don't know what state they're in unless they're getting some sort of data on what's going on in those pipe networks, on where potential leaks are occurring or where potential breaks are going to occur, where you've got issues with water quality or water age. And so kind of taking all of these different parameters, the flow or consumption, the quality, the temperature, the pressure, if you can pull all that together, you can start to make some pretty good analysis of kind of the overall performance, the efficiency, but also the condition or the health of those assets and those networks.
So, it seems like we are at an inflection point. There's things happening, right? And so, when you think of that, are we at an inflection point? And if that's the case, what are the shifts that you're seeing as part of that?
Yeah, I think we absolutely are. It's kind of funny to think about, like, water metering is, well over 100-year-old industry, right? And I just actually, many of the companies that we profile in this report are, 100 years old, 150 years old. I just quickly before this pod took a quick average, and of the 20 main companies that we look at in the report, the average age is 80 years old. So it's not, it's an old sector, especially relative to when we think about digital water and all of these kind of new emerging technologies. It's kind of a imbalance there in terms of how we're thinking about these players. But all of that being said, there's a ton of change happening in the metering sector. I think especially right now, what's been interesting in this report is just kind of, as I said at the beginning, we're talking about hardware, software, services, and connectivity, those four elements of the metering market. And there's a lot of change happening in each of those, right? And we kind of walk through that in the report. But just a couple, technology changes, for example, within meter hardware specifically, we're seeing this big shift towards static meters, right? The kind of traditional umbrella term for the kind of legacy metering technology that's been in place for many years is mechanical meters. And there's different types of mechanical meters, but essentially something is moving within the meter, something, there's a jet that's spinning or kind of positive displacement meters, things are moving in the meter as water is entering them. And that's used to essentially measure how much water is being consumed. But when you have these moving parts, you also have greater opportunity for things to wear down, for things to become less accurate over time, and ultimately for the meter to fail. And so there's these new kind of static metering technologies that don't have moving parts, right? So they're, the kind of the promise, at least, is that they are accurate for, they're much more accurate kind of out of the box, but they also maintain their accuracy over time, and they are just longer lasting, right? It's kind of it's a long-term investment that you're going to put that thing in your customer's basement or in a meter pit, and it's going to last for 15, 20 years at least, right? That's kind of the promise of that technology. And so that's one big shift that we're seeing. We're also seeing a lot of changes on the communications front. A lot of the kind of incumbent metering players have offered, especially smart metering or AMI players, have offered their own kind of proprietary AMI solutions that, typically they sell the meters, but they also sell a bunch of networking infrastructure that they install throughout the community. And then the utility basically maintains that infrastructure to collect their data. We're seeing more of a move towards leveraging other types of communications networks that the utility doesn't actually have to manage. So that could be leveraging, commercial cellular networks. It could be new LPWAN technologies, if you've heard of like LoRaWAN or NB-IoT or, LTE-M, these, Sigfox, may they rest in peace, I guess, these different types of communications technologies where basically someone else is kind of installing and maintaining that network. and the utility is able to leverage that and get their meter data transmitted from their meters to the home. There's even, in looking through this in detail for the report, there's, blockchain based communications networks. There's Amazon Sidewalk that we've talked about in the past, which is leveraging, the installed base of Amazon, Ring devices or Echo devices to move data from place to place. So there's just this much broader universe of kind of communications options that have different trade-offs in terms of total cost of ownership, in terms of upfront cost, in terms of, the battery life or the performance of the network. And so utilities have this really broad kind of menu of options that they can choose from. So that's the technology side of it. There's also business model shifts that go along with that, right? We're seeing many of these vendors that are especially offering different types of communications. They're also offering kind of more innovative business models where the utility doesn't have to maintain the network infrastructure, right? They're maybe paying kind of a monthly or a yearly service fee or data transmission fee to use those networks, right? Kind of a network as a service model or a data as a service model where they're not making the upfront investment in the upfront capital investment in the equipment, in the devices. They're just getting the data, right? They're getting the information that they need. And so the vendor, whoever that is, whether it be a metering vendor or a telecommunications firm or some other third-party services firm, they're the ones who are kind of taking on the risk of actually managing those devices and getting the data and putting that into the hands of the utilities. So the business model thing is number two. And then I guess the third big shift that we kind of look at throughout the report is just what's happened with the metering market from COVID, right? I mean, of all of the digital water segments that we track, and I mean, arguably even just more broadly in the water industry, I think you'd be hard pressed to find a segment that was as significantly impacted by COVID as the metering sector was. And there's a couple of reasons for that. I mean, in the early stages of the pandemic, a lot of big ticket kind of high capital investment metering projects were put on hold because utilities were trying to kind of freeze investments. They were trying to figure out what was going on, reduce costs. Not to mention, it just wasn't a good idea to be sending people door to door, like installing meters in people's basements in the early stages of this big health pandemic, right? So there was that. There was a lot of kind of deferment and delayed projects in the beginning. Then we've seen just as we've talked about quite a lot, the massive supply chain disruptions over the past couple of years since COVID, and in particular, semiconductor shortages and other electronics components. It's really kind of roiled the metering sector, and companies have had a lot of trouble kind of meeting demand, especially as we moved out of the early stages of the pandemic. Demand for metering just surged. There's these massive backlogs that basically every vendor is dealing with, but they just can't get the supply they need to actually meet that demand. And so we're hearing about lead times as long as a year, almost 2 years in some cases, 90 weeks lead times on different types of metering devices. Meter vendors have had to kind of put the brakes on developing or launching new products because they're having to put all of their energy into just finding ways to keep making their existing products, finding new supply chain partners and finding new ways, assembly methods just to get their stuff actually made and out the door. And then the last COVID piece here is also all of the post-COVID kind of stimulus funding and recovery funding that we're seeing in places like the US with the IIJA or the RRF funding in the EU that are kind of coming out of COVID, finding, a lot of just infrastructure investment, a lot of support for the sector that is going into, among other things, smart metering and leakage reduction efforts and kind of water conservation efforts. And all of that, again, kind of lends itself well to metering investments.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that stands out in the report to me, and if this is what you're just referring to, the impact of COVID, just looking at year-over-year revenues. I know we've looked at, 10, 15 different companies at their year-over-year revenues from 2018 to 2022. And, some of the bigger players have actually been hit pretty hard, it looks like, revenue-wise. And, otherwise it's either flat, and there are some players that they've seen an uptick. So, I mean, along those same lines, now, since we're talking dollars and cents, what's the size of the metering market? You said that it was 30% of global digital market. So what do we estimate across how many countries are we looking at? What's the size in dollars and or units?
Yeah. So there's about 45 key kind of countries that we look at globally. That's been the basis for our digital water forecast for the past year or two. And so across those 45 countries, we estimate let's call it 2022, the global market for for all, all in, for the hardware, for the software, for the, installation and implementation services, for all the connectivity related expenses that I talked about earlier. It's about $8 billion, right? That's kind of the headline number, growing at about an 8%, maybe, a little less than 8% compound annual growth rate over the course of this decade. And we project it's about a 10-year total of 1.5 billion devices are going to be sold over that time. So that's the meters, whether they be mechanical or static meters, the AMI and AMR endpoints, from about a little more than 100 million per year now up to about 200 million by the end of the decade. And so that's high level. There's a lot going on underneath, right? Obviously a lot of regional variation. At this point, North America has kind of stood out as a leader especially in smart metering. And it's interesting because I think in a lot of, again, when we think about the digital water market more broadly, we see, Europe and Australia in many cases leading the way in a lot of different types of digital applications, typically more sophisticated than your average US utility, for example. But in metering, the US in particular has really kind of led the way. So we estimate that something like a quarter of all metered connections in North America currently have fully remote read capabilities. So, AMI, for example, compared with maybe only about 10% in Europe and maybe 3 or 4% in Australia or in New Zealand. And then if you look at, a lot of developing markets, Asia, Latin America, the lion's share of the population, maybe 60% of the population doesn't have any meters, right? We're not even talking about smart meters. There's no meters, right? They're unmetered. So a lot of the growth in units that we're projecting comes from places like India or China, as we're seeing, obviously populations are growing, but also more and more homes and businesses and people are getting meters, whether they be, smart remote read, static, cut at the top of the line meters, or more likely just very basic mechanical meters to get that basic billing data on kind of how much water is being consumed.
Yeah. Well, I guess one question I have for you related to that is, while there is this technology shift that's happening, I mean, I think when we look at the numbers, the AMI endpoints, as we call it, is expanding its share of the pie or area chart, depending on how you want to visualize it. To your point, mechanical meters, that stack is still growing, right, year over year. So is that, and that's why, because some of these, if you want to call them lesser developed markets, that's where they're deploying, it sounds like.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so mechanical meters account for about 40% of the total market as we've kind of identified it. There's a little bit of growth there associated with, again, kind of demand in emerging markets, as well as just the replacement market, especially in more advanced markets where there is a culture of metering. There's a big install base. A lot of the kind of year over year business of the metering market is just replacing existing customers' meters, adding that inventory so that if a couple meters break here or there, they can go in and replace them, versus these, when, the more exciting stuff is these wholesale shifts where a city signs a new contract to put in a completely, brand new static metering fleet, or they shift to a new technology. There, obviously we track that too, but a decent share of what happens in the industry is just that kind of more mundane, more pedestrian, just replacing an existing customer's existing stock. But in terms of growth, yeah, I mean, so mechanical meters is the biggest pie, but it's not growing very fast. Where we see the change happening again is in static meters. We've got that at about a 15% compound annual growth rate globally. AMI endpoints about a 12% growth rate over the forecast period. And there are some opportunities as well for leapfrogging, right? I mean, I think Oceania, right, Australia and New Zealand, again, very low current base of remote read meters. But we're seeing a jump. They're kind of jumping over AMR, right? For places like North America and Europe, we've seen the metering market, kind of metering technology evolve in waves where you had basically just plain mechanical, non-communicating, quote unquote, dumb meters for decades, right? For generations. Then we had kind of the AMR technology, which basically, you put a radio on the meter. It doesn't transmit very far, but it allows people, allows the utility to just send staff to essentially drive down the street, collect the data from the houses that they're driving past, so they don't actually have to get out, park, get out, go read the meter manually and come back. So it's a bit of a time saver. It is, a little more digital, although certainly not as advanced as the stuff we're seeing now. And then you have the fully remote read technologies that the kind of AMI technologies. Typically, static meters have AMI capabilities built in, so there's not even a separate endpoint that you strap on. It's all kind of one device. And so in places where there wasn't that, there's not a big metering base to begin with, there wasn't this kind of first wave of investment in AMR technology. You're seeing this leapfrogging where utilities are able to just go straight from, maybe not even having meters at all to having some sort of more advanced, remote read AMI or even static meters.
So when we look at this, to that point, you mentioned earlier, I guess, 20 or so different companies. Who are the players to watch? Not necessarily to pick favorites, but who are those leading players, but also who's doing things that are interesting, whether it be M&A or launching new products or strategies, whether it be geographic or product-wise?
Yeah, so I guess the meat of the report, there's a group of 20 major metering companies that we decided to look at. And, there's certainly others out there, right? I think we picked the list in part because they're the biggest players in many cases, but they're also, we wanted to get kind of a regional representation. So we had some, a smaller Australian player, for example, or a couple smaller US players. So within this group of 20, it's really interesting to see kind of the diversity of types of businesses, right? You do have a couple companies that are just water meter pure plays, right? Neptune Technology Group stands out, or Metron Farnier, also a US company. They basically do nothing but water metering. You do also have a pretty extensive group of companies that are metering pure plays, but they also serve, the electric metering or gas metering, or, in Europe, maybe heat, kind of district heat metering and things like that. So, companies like Camstrip or Axioma are two that come to mind in that category. And then you have just massive kind of diversified industrial conglomerates like Honeywell, a $35 billion company that has a, very small fraction of their business dedicated to water metering. Deal Group is another one, a German company that's they also serve like the aviation sector and defense, and they do, it's kind of these broader industrial conglomerates that also have a metering business. So it's an interesting crop. Many of them are publicly traded, or at least they provide some sort of revenue information, which is helpful. And so with that, we've done some kind of market share calculations at a high level, just trying to understand, again, taking total company reported revenues and kind of figuring out what part of the business is water metering. And so based on our estimates, the biggest players are really all US companies, right? There's 4 US companies that all have double-digit market share at a global level. So that would be, Sensus, Neptune, Badger Meter, and Itron. But we are seeing these kind of newer players, in particular from Europe or from China, that are starting to kind of make moves on key regional markets, right? So I already mentioned Camstrip and Axioma. Those are both European players that are making noise in Europe, and Camstrip in particular has been kind of making a lot of noise in the US market. They opened up a manufacturing facility in Georgia, and they're really kind of taking a growing share of the US market. But then some Chinese companies, we look at 3, Centron Wisdom, Suntrot Technologies, Huizhong Instrumentation are the 3 that we look at here. And they're all they obviously have a massive domestic market that they can serve, but they're also kind of making moves into Australia, for example, starting to kind of get some deals, some partnerships in Australia. And I think many of them are targeting more kind of internationally as well. So, a lot of really interesting kind of competitive dynamics here. Again, COVID kind of shook all this up. These technology changes and business model changes are shaking things up and really opening the door for, a lot of the newer companies, the kind of, Camstrips and Axiomas of the world really they're basically static metering pure plays, right? They're not really doing anything else. They're really kind of banking on that shift and kind of trying to do it better than a lot of the larger incumbent players. It's obviously up for debate whether they are or they will do it better, but that's what, they're really trying to capitalize on that market shift.
One of the things we've also looked at is, like you said, they're expanding. They all have come from different places, right? Whether they're diversified, pure plays. But, one of the strategies they've deployed also is just like M&A, basically. They've grown. So according to the report, I know you've mentioned there have been about 30 plus deals that have happened over the past 10, 15 years. But they're not just buying other metering companies. They're doing other things that seem to be enhancing their product portfolios, correct?
Yeah, and I think this is a really interesting trend too. We've put out a couple, research notes and things like that on this trend as well, which is that we see, especially some of the larger kind of incumbent players that have a decent chunk of the metering market, they're looking to the broader digital water market for new opportunities, right? And I'd say probably Badger is the best case of this. If you look at their M&A history over the past 10 years, I think they've made around 10 deals in the past 10 or so years. The first couple of those deals, they bought up new metering technology players, right? I think some of their ultrasonic technology that they are now kind of deploying came from an M&A deal. Some of their kind of cellular AMI capabilities came from an M&A deal. So they're really focusing on shoring up there and kind of transforming their existing metering business. They also bought up a bunch of metering distribution players, kind of regional distributors in the US, kind of bought up some of their supply chain or their distribution chain. So that was their early to mid 2010s M&A strategy. But in the past, really since 2020, they've made 3 consecutive deals buying up other types of kind of digital water remote monitoring or IoT startups, right? So they bought SCAN, which is a big water quality monitoring company. ATI is another water quality monitoring company. And then Syrinix is a pressure monitoring company. And back to the point I was making, earlier on in the podcast, having those 3 sets of capabilities, the kind of flow or consumption data, the quality data, the pressure data, really allows companies and operators, utility operators, to do some really interesting things in terms of understanding and analyzing what's going on in their network, right? So they're really kind of, we say, they're moving upstream from the meter into the distribution network to offer a broader suite of hardware, of software, of services, that are going to kind of capitalize on growing demand for digital solutions in the pipe network itself. But they're not the only ones. I mean, Camstrip also, not necessarily via M&A, but they've launched a metering product that has actually a built-in acoustic leak detection capability. So, kind of a similar route, trying to use those meters actually as a kind of a central node for data collection throughout the network and adding those other kind of, network parameters in addition to the actual meter data itself. Some companies even, Itron or Aclara or Taggle, they also offer wastewater monitoring services. In many cases, basically using that existing AMI network to transmit other types of IoT data back so that, again, sewer overflow monitoring data or flooding data or, hydrogen sulfide monitors, odor monitoring for sewer systems and things like that. So I'd say that's probably one of the more interesting M&A trends we're seeing. And it's not only M&A, as I said, it's also kind of just internal R&D, but we are seeing that move where bigger players are trying to kind of increase their exposure to the broader digital water market and find other pockets of growth within that digital water market.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really interesting space. Like you said, it's a big chunk of the overall pie. It's interesting to see, it across the board, all the different types of companies. I mean, I think you've profiled not only all these companies, but forecasted them, looked at their revenues, and looked at M&A. So there's a lot to unpack here. I think this report that you're sort of referring to, a lot of this analysis comes out, I guess, in the next week to 10 days at the latest. So I really look forward to that. With that being said, as I start to wrap things up, anything else to either add and maybe tell us a little bit about what you're working on?
I think we've covered most of it. I mean, I'm just excited to get this out there. We've also got a kind of an appendix of not just comparing the metering companies themselves, but also looking at a couple of their different product offerings in terms of things like, their battery life, their warranties, their data granularity, their communications options. So that's a little bit new. We haven't done that in any of the reports I've done, at least. So I'm excited to, get that information out there. We're going to have a pretty cool dashboard in our data navigator platform to go along with it, where we're going to combine the forecast data, the sales, the unit sales forecast that we've made, as well as, dollar value forecast, but we're also layering in a lot of the competitive stuff. We're going to include information on these top 20 metering companies and market share and things like that. So I think, a big package of stuff here that we're really excited to get out the door and really looking to get, really hoping we get some good feedback and hoping it's helpful to our clients and our listeners. Other than that, just kind of getting back into, Digital Water Quarterly, going through the M&A data and things like that. So this one's been taking up a good amount of time. So kind of taking a step back and coming up for air and figuring out what else has been going on in the industry.
Yeah, I'm sure, as everybody can tell, there's a lot to unpack here, and it's not just really like I think you alluded to this. It's not really just about metering players. We're not just looking at them specifically. We also look at sort of the entire landscape or ecosystem, because there are lots of opportunities for other third-party firms or service providers or software vendors to leverage the metering as an entry point into the market. And there are lots of different ways, like I said, including telecommunications. That was one interesting point you brought up as well. So really interesting stuff, Eric. Thanks a million for the time. And I don't know, maybe this is the last podcast we'll have you on before you have a third person in your house. We'll see. But if we don't talk to you before then on the podcast, best of luck, and we'll talk soon. Take care.
Thanks a lot, Reese. Really appreciate it.
All right, there you have it. Tons to unpack. Really dense, lots of data, lots of analysis. I can't speak more highly of not only Eric's expertise and what he adds to the digital water insight service, but also Bluefield, and also just in supporting our clients. So if you have any questions about this analysis, it'll be on our website in, like I said, next 7 to 10 days. But also you can always reach out to us at waterexperts@bluefieldresearch.com with any questions. But before we sign off, and not to get ahead of ourselves, if you're in Boston, let us know. We can always set up a meeting. We're right in downtown Boston, and we're more or less in the office every day. So we want to talk to you. We want to see you. So let us know if you want to swing by the office or just grab a coffee and talk water. Please subscribe to the Future Water Podcast and give us a review. Reviews help us help you. And lastly, as I said, send us a note to waterexperts@bluefieldresearch.com with any topic ideas or any questions about the global water metering market, and tell a friend about it. It's really important to us. That's how things spread virally. And to wrap it up, these water industry insights have been brought to you by the one and only Bluefield Research. To learn more about us, visit us at bluefieldresearch.com. Till we talk again, be well, be safe, and take care.